Mexico's President Felipe Calderon calls for a global debate on a less prohibitionist approach to drug policy. Is it an admission of failure after 6 years of bloodshed in his war on drugs? You're watching Inside Story Americas from Washington. Hello, I'm Shihab Ratansi. Felipe Calderon called for a transformation in international thinking on drug policy. In his final speech as president to the United Nations General Assembly, he said that developed countries like the US were not doing enough to cut their drug consumption. So it was time to act.
Nuestra Organización de las Naciones Unidas.
Today, I am proposing formally that this organization, the United Nations, make a commitment to this area, that they carry out a far-reaching assessment of the progress and limits of the current prohibitionist approach when it comes to drugs.
Del actual enfoque prohibicionista en materia de drogas. La ONU tiene que encabezar.
The United Nations has to lead a far-reaching international debate which would make it possible to take stock, on the one hand, of the progress and limits of the current prohibitionist approach, which has led to the results that we've achieved thus far. They must also carry out a study on the human violence, the unacceptable violence that is produced by the production, distribution, and trafficking of drugs in this world, and which has made, it is painful to say this, but it has made Latin America and the Caribbean the most violent region in the world. And this assessment must be done honestly and rigorously and with global responsibility. We have to explore those alternatives. We have to explore specifically regulatory or market alternatives which can make it possible, if there are alternatives, which would allow us, all nations together, to put an end to this scourge which is claiming thousands and thousands of lives.
It's a remarkable turnaround for a man who, during his 6-year presidency, launched and presided over a war on drugs that killed an estimated 60,000 of his people. Those who have long called for a change in policy have applauded his bold call to action, while at the same time noting that Calderon's emphatic plea to the UN was not actually mentioned in the official UN summary of his comments. Earlier I spoke to Sanho Tree, director of the Drug Policy Project at the Institute of Policy Studies. I first asked him what he made of that omission.
Well, it sounds like a lot of censorship, actually, because fully half of his speech was devoted towards criticizing the international war on drugs and the conventional approaches that have been undertaken. And yet, when you read the official summary on the website, it's as though it's been scrubbed of any type of criticism. In fact, it makes him sound like a cheerleader, that we need to redouble our efforts and everything's rosy. And it's actually quite offensive because future historians and also journalists who will be looking at these summaries of speeches to see if there's anything worth looking at here, won't bother clicking on the video and listening to the 50-minute address, but will assume from the summary that there was really no criticism of the drug war.
The Guatemalan president singled out various UN conventions that he said had needed to be changed. What is the UN's role as more and more countries demand reform?
Well, they're very defensive about reopening the discussion about amending these conventions. There are 3 of them. And they basically keep the international drug war locked in place. Most countries point to these conventions and say that's our legitimacy for doing the things that we're doing. It's part of the international consensus. Of course, the so-called great powers, particularly the United States, ignores a lot of other conventions. Other countries take them much more seriously than the U.S. However, the conventions, if you were to reopen them and have a discussion about them, it would open up a can of worms that the U.S. and other powers would very much like to keep contained. The international drug war is based in Vienna, Austria, where the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime is located, as well as the Commission on Narcotic Drugs. And they are the protectors of the international drug war conventions. And it's based on something called the Vienna Consensus, which is really not a consensus. It's a public, coerced consensus, if you will. That is to say, any state that tries to deviate from that would basically have to expose themselves and be subject to all kinds of reprisals, bilaterally or otherwise. And so countries basically shut up and go along with that so-called consensus. If you were, however, to have a secret vote, I think that consensus would collapse overnight.
So what does this mean for the future of the war on drugs? With me to discuss this is Bruce Fein, a former U.S. Associate Deputy Attorney General. From St. Louis, Missouri, Sylvia Longmire, an analyst on the drug war. And from Mexico City, Laura Carlsen, Director of the Americas Program at the Center for International Policy. Actually, before we go on, let's hear a little bit more about what Felipe Calderon was arguing. Beyond arguing for looking at a less prohibitionist view of the drug issue, he also said that countries, developed worlds, have to look at it more realistically in viewing drugs as a public health problem.
If developed countries, the ones that consume tons and tons of drugs on a daily basis, if they cannot or do not want to reduce drug consumption, then at least they should stop the money being sent to criminals. At least they must stop the exorbitant flow of money with which criminals are financing themselves and claiming the lives of thousands of young people. And if they can't do this, it's the time to explore, I insist, it's the time to explore different alternatives when it comes to reducing consumption.
Así como debemos ocuparnos de la epidemia, como el virus de influenza H1N1 que nos...
Just as we should deal with epidemics such as HIV, the H1N1 virus that affected Mexico, just as we should deal with climate change, it is now time as well to enter into action to stop this wave of death, which is causing so much suffering to our people. And I respectfully urge the United Nations to not only take part, but to lead a discussion on the challenges of the 21st century, without any false approaches, which would lead all of us to seek solutions to this very serious problem, using new and effective approaches.
So clearly quite a significant set of policy proposals to the United Nations. Actually, once again, just to make clear what the UN summary was of all of that, was about 4 lines in their summary. Calderon said, quote, "It was time for the United Nations to do more, including through assisting with the creation of a normative policy framework that combated crime, strengthened laws and law enforcement agencies, and restored social fabrics," end quote. That's it in the UN summary of the speech. They're still very much sticking to this being an issue of law and order. But Laura Carlsen, first of all then, what are we to make of that? After so much death, he seems to be acknowledging that the entire foundation of his policy couldn't work.
That's right. This is an extraordinary speech. It's a very honest assessment of the fact that after 6 years of applying this drug war, he's saying it didn't work. It failed. Of course, he does try to shift blame in large part to the developed countries, to the consuming countries. He says that they failed to reduce consumption, which of course is true. He also mentions armed trafficking, and he mentions their whole role in this. But at the same time, he is saying, almost in a tone of frustration, this didn't work, it cost us way too much, and it's time to change it. So it's absolutely outrageous once he's thrown down the gauntlet to the United Nations and indirectly to the United States government, which has been a main proponent, of course, of the drug war in Mexico, that the United Nations is giving this indication that it plans to completely ignore the challenge and once again stick with the same old drug war, as if this hadn't even been said by one of the main proponents and one of the countries that's paid the highest price.
Before we look into that in a bit more detail, I mean, what about the implications for Mexico? There's a new government being sworn in on December the 1st. Might this have implications?
Well, it very well might. It's going to be fascinating because it's no small thing that the previous president is now saying that this didn't work and laying out all kinds of other options on the table. What we know so far is that Enrique Peña Nieto has said that he will continue. He will toe the line that the United States is giving him under the Merida Initiative and other support for the drug war, and that he wants to make perhaps some changes but no major changes. So now that we have this proposal to, on a national and international level, look at some real alternatives, he's going to have to make some decisions, and he's got a real challenge behind him.
Captain Longmire, I mean, there is that tradition there of presidents and past leaders in Latin America speaking out about the drug war once they've left office, and clearly President Calderon is also on his way out. But at least it shows how far the debate has come, if this debate is now in the UN General Assembly.
Yeah, it's interesting to see that Calderon is willing to make such bold statements while he's still in office. You know, we've seen for the last couple of years that former President Vicente Fox has been extremely outspoken on different tours of countries and presentations that he's given in the United States and Mexico and abroad. But he wasn't that outspoken when he was still in office. So now that Calderon, he still has a couple months left, and I think he's just planting the seed for maybe that thought process to spread a little bit and maybe influence Peña Nieto a little bit to continue the dialogue or continue the push for a revision of international drug policy.
Well, another president who spoke out, who still has a long way to go in his term, was the Guatemalan president, Otto Perez Molina. Actually, initially in an Associated Press interview, there was a suggestion that he was actually going to call for the legalization of drugs at the UN General Assembly. He didn't do that, but he was still very scathing. Here's what he had to say.
We believe that our war against drugs has serious shortcomings. It has not been possible to eradicate the consumption of drugs in the world. The time has come to accept this fight and to adapt this fight, taking into account the new realities. It's important that we address the problem for what it is, a public health issue more than a problem for criminal justice. Let us not fill our jails with thousands of young people who can have a different life if we approach this in a different way.
Bruce Fein, I mean, it's more proof that this isn't a left or right issue in Latin America anymore. Otto Perez Molina, no kind of hippie lefty by any means. How's all this being viewed in Washington, do you think?
Washington would look at it with great distaste. President Obama clearly has discouraged and said, despite what the Latin American or Central American leaders might think, the United States is not wavering an inch on its military approach to the drug war. And it's not just the 6 years of Calderon that has proven a failure. I came to Washington 45 years ago as President Nixon, about 42 years ago, that announced the war on drugs. It was escalated to the military level where it began to be employed despite our Posse Comitatus Act that frowns on military for domestic law enforcement in the 1980s. And I think the analysis shows the incidence of drugs is about the same. We spent over $1 trillion and there's no one standing up and saying there's light at the end of the tunnel. We simply go through it because it's viewed as politically very dicey to back away from the drug war. Well, then you're yielding, capitulating to a soft society or whatever.
But Laura Carlsen, I mean, Perez Molina is an interesting figure. On the one hand, he is saying all this. On the other hand, he is trying to get, reinstatement of U.S. military aid and so forth. I mean, some have questioned his motivations. What do you think is going on?
Well, it is very contradictory what he's done on this. He's taken an international stance calling for alternatives to the drug war. I think he realizes that his country in the long term cannot support a drug war. It doesn't have the judicial system, it doesn't have the resources, and it's risky for it to get involved in another military type war after the counterinsurgency war. But on the other hand, as you mentioned, he's been very willing to allow the United States to come into the country. They've got warships now that are on the coast of Guatemala. So people are wondering what's going on. If you really look at what he says, he's extremely cautious about any real changes. So it does seem that there's some kind of political play there in the particular approach that Perez Molina is taking to this drug war. It's good that he's calling to open up debate, but what he's actually willing to do and how much he really has the security of his nation in this whole mess that's a war on drugs at heart is still a little bit suspect because of the contradictions.
If I could explain it, it doesn't seem to me at all irrational for this reason. To step out in front at present would mean the possible or probable loss of your military, your economic, your trade assistance with the United States, because there's a law here that says if you're listed as non-cooperating in the drug war, then you lose all these benefits. And so he needs to get an international consensus, so the United States at that time, given the debate, has relaxed this kind of sanction or sledgehammer over any country that tries to experiment with a non-criminal approach, and he doesn't then pay that domestic penalty.
Right, but I mean, the key, I suppose, are countries, perhaps not in Central America, but in South America or in Mexico, for that matter, who perhaps have more leverage. Juan Manuel Santos, another leader, the president of Colombia, spoke out as well. Here's what he had to say at the UN General Assembly.
Y es nuestro deber determinar.
It is our duty to determine on objective scientific basis if we are doing the best we can, or if there are better options to combat this scourge.
Pero ese es solo un primer paso.
This is only a first step, but one of great importance, as it is the beginning of a discussion that the world has avoided for many years, and one we hope will produce concrete results. The debate on drugs must be frank, and without a doubt, global.
Now, Captain Longmire, Juan Manuel Santos is particularly interesting because he was speaking out as far back as 1998. I have a letter he wrote to Kofi Annan, along with many others, saying that we have to move away from criminalization and punishment when it comes to drugs. And in fact, even then, he was very critical about the UN's role with its drug conventions, which isn't something we've explored very much in the past. We usually explore this issue much more in a sense of regional issues and the relationship with the United States and so forth. But at the UN General Assembly, it was notable that UN conventions were coming under a great deal of criticism. What role are they playing?
Well, the UN conventions, I think, are more symbolic than anything else. I don't believe the United Nations as a whole really has a lot of teeth when it comes to actual enforcement or reprisals against countries. But because they've been around for so long and people refer to the UN for international disputes, they still have some kind of regard in international circles. So like Dr. Senho Tree was talking earlier, the mentions in the convention, if you go against it or pull out of it, you're going to be exposed and possibly experience reprisals. Bolivia pulled out of the convention maybe a year or two ago because Bolivia has a big legal coca production tradition for religious and other uses. So Bolivia was upset that the convention didn't take into account the traditional uses for growing coca legally. So they want an amendment to it. And eventually Bolivia wants to go back into the convention after amendments are made specific to Bolivia's case. But in the grand scheme of things globally, Bolivia is not as significant a country as the United States when it comes to international drug policy. So nobody's making a big deal about Bolivia. Now, if the United States were to pull out of it, it's a little different. I mean, the United States, like Dr. Tree said before, is already going against different aspects of the convention. For instance, advertising prescription drugs on television. That goes against the convention, but the United Nations isn't really doing anything to punish the United States because of it. So the conventions play a role in that all signatory countries, I think something like 186, are playing along with it right now, but there's definitely wiggle room, and I think that if the United States really wanted to take the initiative to kind of lead the charge in an international drug policy revision, if the will were there, they could do it, but the will's just not there right now.
Right, so Laura Carlsen, again, that's why we see leader after leader coming to New York, making these very bold statements about a need for a rethink. Where is this going in the absence of any U.S. leadership? How far can this go?
Well, that's right. I mean, the UN conventions are important because they're an international framework and they kind of set the terms. But the problem with the United States is not just that it's been unwilling to take on those conventions or to lead a change, to open up the kind of discussion that these leaders are calling for. It's been that it's been blocking it. When the Obama administration came into power, a lot of us were watching to see if there would be changes because he talked as a candidate about making some changes. Would they recognize indigenous use of coca in countries like Bolivia? Would they start entertaining the idea that harm reduction programs actually save lives? You know, would they declassify marijuana, which was now classified as one of the most dangerous drugs? These really common sense scientific things that could have been done in the conventions, and it turned out that none of that happened. It turned out that instead of that, the United States has really become entrenched in the drug war, and not only that, but spread it to the other countries in the continent. And they do have so much economic dependency, like Bruce mentioned, that it's impossible for them to really move a lot on this, even though they recognize the dangers to their countries. So really, when they present this kind of proposal to the United Nations, what they're saying is, push the United States to do the right thing. We've got to open this discussion. It's not fair that our countries are paying this kind of a price. Something's got to give here.
Bruce Fein, is there the slightest chance then that that is going to happen here in Washington when Felipe Calderon makes such an impassioned plea, as we just heard, to treat in the developed world this as a health problem and not as a problem of law and order? What chance?
I think it's slim to none. And if you survey the presidential campaign here in the United States, you haven't got a single syllable from either President Obama or the challenger, Mr. Romney, that other than the criminal approach is going to be adopted. If anything, as the Obama administration has continued since its inauguration in 2009, it's sort of increased, upgraded its enforcement efforts, even within states that have medical marijuana laws and things of that sort, making very clear the federal prohibition is going to remain, irrespective of whether the states at the state level try to relax. So there's no evidence that politically, and perhaps it's least likely in a political year where you could imagine the candidates thinking, my gosh, if I come out for a liberalization kind of program here, I'll be scolded by my opponent and I'm not going to risk losing those votes.
But Laura Carlsen, I mean, you say it's very difficult for these countries in Latin America to move. However, we hear about major initiatives of the Organization of American States and so forth. Are they then just symbolic? Should we not be paying them that much heed?
Well, I think some countries are making that move, and this is all part of the independence movement within Latin America, that they've been breaking out of U.S. hegemony. And they've been willing to suffer some economic consequences, like removing the DEA from their country means a cutback in aid from the United States. And as they begin to build up these South-South organizations, there's more possibilities to have independent policies. And one of the ones they'll be looking at is new drug policies. But again, it's very difficult, and it's especially difficult for a country like Mexico. Here you're talking about a nation that has more than 80% of its international trade dependent on one country, the United States. So what the United States says pretty much goes in Mexico, and it doesn't have a lot more room. The hope is that other countries will have a little bit more independence and that depend more on each other rather than just the United States market economically will be able to take more independent stances and really begin to do something about getting rid of a war on drugs that's been a disaster.
But Captain Longmire, given these pleas from across Latin America, and given the intensification of the military response from Washington, I mean, they are expanding from Operation Hammer, the Marines sent to Guatemala. We hear about, we recently have heard unwittingly about DEA operations in Mexico. There was an incident in Honduras recently as well. You have to wonder, is this actually about drugs at all?
Well, when you take a look at it from a border security perspective, we do know that that is a big moneymaker, and we do know that there's a long history of U.S. intervention in Latin America, and particularly with the CIA, looking at the drug trade and how the U.S. historically has manipulated illicit activity, not just in Latin America, but globally to achieve certain goals that are maybe not as open to the rest of Americans and the world as maybe some of us would like. So I think a large part of it still is about drugs. We have a long history of moral issues with the drug use, particularly in the last century. But there's always the possibility that we're talking about manipulation of policy, manipulation of leadership to go along with whatever the U.S. plan is for the hemisphere.
Bruce Fein, you probably know better than most. I mean, is this really about drugs? And as they expand their military operations, they use the issue of drugs to expand their military footprint in many of these countries. Yeah,
and I think you're exactly right. CIA undercover, and they're able to justify it, saying some of this money can leak into terrorism, FARC, and I'm sure they'll find some trace of connection between money laundering into the United States, and it's a way in which we can get access to information and intelligence collection through a military relationship that otherwise would be much more difficult to penetrate. But the reason why you'd ask, why are we increasing the military presence there? If you saw some correlation between the greater use of the military and a reduction in drugs, it might make sense, but they haven't been able to find any such correlation. And of course, military people aren't trained in law enforcement. They're trained in military exercises, which is gather information and kill or destroy an enemy.
Laura Carlsen, how wide is that military footprint now across Latin America? Is it possible even to tell?
It's increased tremendously just in the last 5 years or so. And the correlation that we do see, there's no correlation between militarization and a reduction in drug flows, really. But we do see this huge correlation between militarization and an increase in violence, and especially selective violence. We're seeing increases in violence against women, violence against indigenous populations, violence against poor, and in certain areas where there's strong economic interests. We've seen the expansion of military base in Honduras, plus 2 new ones. We've seen Mexico, where military is not involved, now overrun, basically, with agencies that are supposedly fighting a drug war, and yet there's a suspicious lack of progress ever on the drug war front. And that can be said for almost all the countries. The move after Mexico was strongly into Central America. Of course, Colombia was the pioneer. And now the talk is to have a major offensive into the Caribbean countries. So the expansion continues in the face of an utter lack of evidence. In fact, a lot of evidence that the war on drugs is counterproductive in all senses.
Thank you very much. Laura Carlsen, Captain Sylvia Longmire, thank you. Bruce Fein, thank you. That's all from the team in Washington, D.C. for now.